This is a really important story that I think should be spread far and wide, and I'm happy to have Haas here break it down with me. And it's the story, it's the tale of the DeSantis Deception. Yet again, the George Bush neoconservative faction of the Republican Party is trying to use virtue signal, domestic anti-woke policies this time to try and bring a neoconservative actor back into the helm of power within the GOP in this country. They're trying to subvert, MAGA supremacy in doing this. And we're going to talk about this and talk about DeSantis in further detail. But the first thing I want to share with you is from Robert Barnes, who you all know is someone who's represented. We've had him on the show. He's a great attorney. He's represented Kyle Rittenhouse, I believe, Alex Jones, Ralph Nader, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. I believe he helped Trump on some certain cases, like helped him, tried to help them on Assange and stuff like that. So he's someone who definitely considers himself within the ranks of the MAGA movement, but he's also just an incredible voice on the quote unquote right in America. We call it the truth here. But he said, when in Congress, DeSantis followed neocons on foreign policy, globalists on trade, and Paul Ryan on budget policy. He even backed eliminating Social Security and Medicare for those under 70. He'd get killed in a general election in 2024. Trump is the only Republican who can win this. So Haas, I'm going to shoot it over to you. What are your thoughts on the DeSantis deception?
Well, I mean, it's clear as day. The only real way you can check a politician's record on it, I mean, you can judge a politician. It's not really by what they say. It's their record. How have they acted in the past when they did have any semblance of power? It's very clear when you look at DeSantis' record. He's your typical swamp monster. He's with them. He's always been with them. And he's never deviated from that on any level, except, mysteriously, his defiance of the extremely abnormally harsh lockdown policies during COVID. Now, was this intentional to win the trust of the American people in order that they would trust him to be some kind of populist champion against the status quo? Who knows, right? But if you ask me, I think the ruling class would rather experiment with, letting the lockdowns kind of be defied rather than allow their pro-war agenda to be defied or their broader foreign policy global ambitions to be defied. Now, the importance of foreign policy in judging the authenticity of a candidate has to do with the following fact. The power of our ruling class is based on the global control they exert through the American unipolar system. Without that system, we don't have a ruling class and we don't have an establishment. So you have to really judge what a relationship politicians bear in relation to that system in order to see whether they mean what they say when they're talking about how they're going to champion the cause of the American people in any kind of way. Now, I'll basically give a rundown of the DeSantis deception. The ruling class realized how many people were loyal to Trump and saw Trump as an alternative to the entirety of the prevailing institutions of civil society. The Rockefeller and Ford Foundation-funded institutions that are pushing gender ideology and pushing critical race theory and all of this woke stuff on the American people. So they realize that, people either see Trump and then they see the establishment. So what they've done is very intelligent. They've actually planted a politician that people will see as an alternative to Trump in being able to trust, as opposed to what they see on TV in the mainstream. They'll have the media constantly attacking DeSantis for his culture war posturing and all this stuff. And suddenly people can make a transition from trusting Trump, who's represented some kind of alternative and defiance, to DeSantis. And this is their way of regaining the trust of the American people to build consensus for war. That's what this is actually about. Under Joe Biden, the American people are extremely skeptical of the Ukraine war or the Ukraine agenda, right? There has to be a way our ruling class can win back the trust of the people so that they can wage more wars or engage in more aggressive and hostile actions to contain Russia, China, and Iran. And they're using DeSantis to do that. They don't actually care about the woke stuff that much. I mean, put it this way. Under George W. Bush, he was not particularly in favor of gay marriage. And although gay marriage was part of the agenda of the ruling class, they're willing to put that on the back burner and kind of, save that for later as long as they can build consensus for war. That's what they actually care about. they're more interested in the American people agreeing and having consent for war against China, Russia, and other countries, and Iran, than, this stuff about transgender bathrooms and all this LGBT stuff. And I don't mean to be too much of a conspiracy theorist, but sometimes I feel like they're pushing this LGBT stuff on children. They're doing it in such an extreme way just to have DeSantis seem like reasonable in comparison, and then nobody pays attention to the war aspect or the foreign policy aspect. I think it's kind of unfortunate.
I fully agree with everything you said regarding DeSantis, and I think the most important litmus test that we could look to is who controls you? Who controls you? I mean, at some degree, some level, some threshold, everyone is controlled, right? I think there's a few notable exceptions. To a very large extent, I think Trump represented one of those exceptions, despite the fact that, he had poor decision-making in many cases that and kind of filled that void. But when it comes to DeSantis, I mean, he's a full-blown Zionist. If you look at his, and I don't want to, bore you all with his congressional record, but it is there. You can look at it. You can look on Ballotpedia. You can find it online and see that when it comes to China, when it comes to Russia, when it comes to Ukraine, when it comes to Taiwan, Iran, Syria, Venezuela, Nicaragua, any of the countries that are the official baddies of the CIA and the intelligence community, he was gung-ho in supporting all of the efforts of destabilization, sanctions, coups, regime change attempts, so on and so forth. When Trump made the disastrous decision, and he was, encouraged to do this by people like Mike Pompeo, to bring John Bolton into the ranks of his administration, DeSantis came out and said John Bolton is a very strong voice and a very clear thinker. We also have this right here, which shows how probably DeSantis would be acting today if he were president, not too much unlike the Democrats. In 2015, DeSantis co-sponsored a bill that claimed Russia illegally occupied Crimea, and he argued Yanukovych was democratically deposed rather than ousted in a coup. He also guaranteed U.S. loans for Ukraine. So, I mean, this guy, it's as clear as it gets. He is the DeSantis Deception. He's going to take the Republican movement, the MAGA movement, down the road of, George Bush 2.0. I mean, quite literally, he's a fraternity brother of George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush and Yale's Delta Kappa Epsilon. So he's literally their fraternity brother. Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah, all that dark money, it's all shifting to DeSantis. The big money's going to DeSantis. The special interests are all waging and betting on DeSantis. I mean, you've even got all of these rhinos getting behind DeSantis now. I mean, there's a reason for all of this, right? I think the media has preemptively already decided. They've gotten really arrogant with it even that, yeah, Trump's gone now. It's DeSantis who's going to be facing Biden in 2024. Hopefully they're wrong about that, and this is just them overplaying their hands, as they did in 2016 when they thought Hillary Clinton, of all people, would beat Trump. But DeSantis is their guy. Yeah, and the last thing I want to say about DeSantis is he had a series of very popular viral campaign ads in his 2022 campaign, successful bid for governor, by a long shot, by the way. But, he had these successful campaign ads, and they were based around the theme of Top Gun. Okay, so he's like acting like a U.S. Air Force fighter. He's in the, USAF, like clothing and military garb, and he's getting in the fighter jet, stuff like this. And when people saw this ad going viral, a lot of people were like, oh, I didn't know he was U.S. Air Force. Well, it turns out he wasn't U.S. Air Force. So the question then becomes, why is Ron DeSantis acting like he's LARPing like U.S. Air Force at a time when Top Gun is popular, and he's not giving, he's not shedding light, so to speak, on his actual military background? The answer becomes quite clear when you learn about his military background. He did service in Fallujah, which is obviously seen as deeply unpopular by many Americans, a deeply unpopular foreign policy decision by many Americans nowadays. But also, he had a unique role in which he served at Guantanamo Bay. There's actually recordings. I can play a little bit of one of them right now. Recordings of individuals who were actually held prisoner at Guantanamo Bay
under, illegal constraints. They were never found guilty. They were eventually released, talking about the fact that Ron DeSantis worked at Guantanamo Bay under the guise of being there to protect the rights of those that are in prison, when in fact what he actually was there doing was trying to get close to the inmates at Guantanamo Bay, hear their concerns, hear their mentality, and he would use that and supply that information to superiors at Guantanamo Bay, which would then use that information against them in the various torture projects that were going on there at the torture facility. I want to play a little bit of this clip. Take a listen.
I think I'll show you guys too what he's talking about.
His job to walk around and talk to prisoners. And the camp, that was his job, because the report, like, I'm here to ensure you're being treated humiliated. I'm telling Americans, if this is humanity,
I know exactly what he's talking about.
This guy is torture, is a criminal.
So this, by the way, is a former detainee at Guantanamo, but who was tortured, put on, trapped to chairs and stuff, to, force feed him and stuff like that. This is what he had to say.
Mansour Adaifi, known to DeSantis as Detainee 441. Mansour, sold to the U.S. by Afghan warlords after 9/11, was a totally innocent teenager held at Guantanamo Bay from 2002 until 2016, so he has a robust knowledge of life and torture at Gitmo. He told me that not only was DeSantis there for what he called the worst year of his entire imprisonment, but DeSantis was a notorious figure who didn't just know about, but observed and participated in illegal acts of torture and in fact seemed to take great pleasure in their suffering. He reveals that the job of DeSantis was not to ensure human rights were respected, but to ensure that they were violated to the worst degree.
It was a mission, and he was there. All of them was watching, the colonel, officers, doctors, nurses, and not just that, they used to also beat us. And if we scream or pain, bleeding came out of our nose and mouth, they would eat. The only word they told you, eat, eat, eat.
Mansour Adaifi was held at Guantanamo Bay without charges and without trial between 2002 and 2016. He was handed over to the CIA as an 18-year-old goat farmer. And Adaifi says Ron DeSantis oversaw the worst acts of torture during his time there.
So we went again on hunger strike. We were on force feeding. It was torture. We were bleeding all the time. And I saw a handsome person who was coming. He said, I'm here to ensure that you're treating humanely. And we said, okay, this is our demand. We were not asking for much, At the beginning, he was just...
It was Ron DeSantis.
Yes, exactly. The person.
He said, I'm here to ensure you're being treated humanely.
Yes, exactly. And if you have any problems, if you have any concerns, just talk to me. And we were drowning at that place. I'm like, oh, this is cool. That person actually writing something. He will raise the concerns, but it was piece of the game. What they were doing, they were looking what hurt you more to use it against you. By the end of 2005, 2006, when he was there, one of the worst time at Guantanamo, literally. Force feeding. I swear by my God, Mike, they brought, piles of ensure, and they start force feeding us over and over again. And Ron DeSantis was there and watching us. We were crying, screaming. We were tied to the feeding chair, and that guy, he was watching that, he was laughing basically. It was hurt like hell. And I was screaming, when I was screaming, and look at him. And he was actually smiling as someone who enjoying it. When they used to feed us, because our stomach cannot hold this amount of ensure. They used to pour ensure one can after another. So when he approached me, I said, this is the way we are treated. You should start to eat. I threw up in his face, literally on his face.
Ron DeSantis.
And in his face, yeah. They used to, restrain us in the feeding chair, which 8 point, they tied our heads, our shoulder, our wrist, our thighs, and our legs. And they came, and that was really thick tube, they call it French 17 or something, through our nose. And they keep doing this over and over again, and they put some kind laxative in the feeding liquid with we shit ourselves all the time.
You're saying that DeSantis initially, because he presented himself as the lawyer whose job it was to ensure you're being treated humanely, then you and other detainees told him the things that were the hardest for you to deal with, the things that you felt needed to change. And then instead of actually making sure those things changed and that your human rights are respected, he then basically like was gathering intelligence to then tell the prison camp and the interrogators what it was that was impacting you most so they could do it more to you.
Exactly. That what happened there, because the things we used to tell them, it turned against us. Everything we talked to him become multiple because he was looking at the impact on you, what hurt you more. Ron DeSantis was there all the time because his job to walk around and talk to prisoners. Like, I'm here to ensure you're being treated humanely. I'm telling Americans, if this is humanity, this guy is torture, is a criminal.
So there you have it from the man himself. He literally, so when DeSantis goes out on his little tours and he goes out on his campaign rallies and stuff like that, the question that must be asked of him is, what was it like? We got to get this prisoner's name, but the question we should all be asking DeSantis is, when he's out campaigning, is, what was it like when Guantanamo Bay prisoner, who was eventually freed, whatever his name is, was tortured in front of your face and then threw up in your face when you got close and you were laughing at him? What was that like? That's the question you should ask Ron DeSantis when you see him in person. Or ask him about, the atrocities of the, Israeli Zios that he supports vociferously. Or ask him about, his support for the Ukrainian Nazis. You have your pickings, but this is the type of guy Ron DeSantis is, and do not fall for the deception of him, because he is the largest threat that America currently faces, because he is populist, if you will, when it comes to these domestic issues, these woke issues, gender issues, COVID-based issues. He's going to ride his coattails on those issues without ever attempting to address his neoconservative foreign policy.
Yeah, we're dealing with a very sick person, and it's not uncommon for members of the ruling class in general to be very sick, depraved people. I think it's an indictment on his character, but even more so, it just reveals how much he's in bed with the people he purports to be fighting against. He talks about the media, he talks about the these people are all in the same boat with each other,
Yeah, 100%. So, on that note, it's just, the last thing I'll say about it, I'm not going to put this in the video, but don't you think it's just so crazy, like how far we've come from great leaders like George Washington, and now we're at a point where it's like we have the guy who got thrown up in his face while at Guantanamo Bay laughing at a tortured detainee from halfway around the world in a place we never should have been, and he's like the guy that's going to become president. How is that we went from George Washington to this? It's just crazy.
Well, our government has been hijacked is really the only logical explanation.
Yeah.